Kia ora koutou, no mai hoki mai. It's Chris here, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're responding to an article published in the spin-off by Tame Malcolm, who argues that the use of the controversial poison 1080 is aligned with traditional tikanga Māori. He compares deterrence with outright violence and dropping poison to Māori warfare, along with other nonsense. Before we get started, I'm no expert on tikanga Māori or 1080. I'm not here to define tikanga Māori, and I'm not here to address whether or not 1080 even works. All we're doing today is looking at Tame's arguments and seeing if they justify his claims. But first, a short mihi to Tame Malcolm. He's a descendant from Te Aroha Whānui and Ngāti Ruanui, and has been working in the conservation space here in Aotearoa for many years. Although we disagree, we here at Aotearoa Liberation League sincerely acknowledge his intention and have no doubt about his sincerity towards his actions in helping Papatūānuku. Kario e kōrero ki te takahi tana mana, engari he rere taku whakaaro ki te take nei. Kapai, let's get to his points. First one, Tame says, Māori history and culture has many examples of toxin use. Kawakawa, for example, was used to kill insects, a known insecticide. It would be buried in the ground around kumara gardens, adding poison to the whenua to deter insects. Normally, you use the kawakawa that have lots of little holes in it. Those are insect bites. That's how you know when it's ready. He calls it an insecticide, kapai. Deterring insects and slowly poisoning animals are two completely different things. We attract animals to 1080 using bait, 1080 bait, literally the exact opposite of a deterrent. Insects, like other animals, avoid plants that are poisonous to them. That's why kawakawa trees aren't surrounded by a sea of dead animals or insects. The kawakawa trick, though, sounds like a perfect non-violent way of protecting your kai. So, Tame, thanks for the tip. Next point, Tame says, some readers may be thinking Kawakawa is from our whenua, whereas 1080 isn't, but the active ingredient in 1080, sodium monofluoroacetate, can be found naturally occurring in puha in small amounts. This is a meaningless point. I mean, all chemical compounds originate from the whenua, even the deadliest of poisons. Cyanide, for example, is found in fungi, algae, bacteria. Even small traces of it are in the native titoki plant found here in Aotearoa. But 1080 is made synthetically by treating sodium chloroacetate with potassium fluoride. While small amounts of sodium fluoroacetate exist in some plants, synthetically creating that compound and concentrating it to the point of killing animals is another thing entirely. That's a complex chemical process. Comparing it to boil-up greens is inappropriate. Next point. At some past sites around the country, our tupuna would line their kumara pits with Rarauhe, bracken fern. Kiore that would try to burrow into the kumara pits would have to gnaw through the toxic plant to get to the kumara, thus get poisoned. I've heard of this one. My kuya used to line boxes for harvested kumara with rarauhe, bracken fern, and it would act as a deterrent from animals that want to eat the kumara. And studies will show that these animals will avoid plants such as these, those that are poisonous to them, unless there's nothing else to eat. Even so, they need to eat a large quantity of the poison of this plant, and then, after a long period of time, they might get cancer and slowly die. It's not really something that can protect your crops in the meantime. Again, this was likely not used as a poison, but instead a deterrent. A beautiful Māori non-violent deterrent. Next, he compares Tūpāpaku, a dead body, usually human, to toxins. Toxins in the water were not something foreign to our tupuna. In some iwi, Tūpāpaku were buried in lakes and rivers. This would result in a rāhui being placed on that area. And for physical and spiritual well-being, no food or water was to be taken from there. Firstly, let's just acknowledge that Tame is comparing burial rituals to aerial dropping poison. This is a common theme for Tame. He's claiming justification from equal consequences of any given action rather than looking at the actions themselves. Yep, you can't hunt in an area that's recently had a 1080 drop. That's partly why hunters are against 1080. Tame is attempting to justify this because you can just call a rāhui. Like, we can do whatever we want as long as it results in a rāhui. Fonterra can dump a load of processing waste as long as it ends in a rāhui. Oh, tika tera, tikanga Māori. What else you got, Tame? Next he says, some have argued that the mass killing of pests that comes with using 1080 toxin is also un-Māori-like, but this argument doesn't really hold up, in my opinion, because our tupuna would catch large quantities of fish using nets. Taruke, crayfish traps, and hinaki both operate on the premise of catching en masse. Hunting for survival versus slowly poisoning millions of animals to death for conservation and farm profits are completely different things. And we know why it's upsetting to see dead bodies everywhere. For me, it's understanding the suffering and pain that these animals would have gone through. For many others, I'm sure it's upsetting seeing all these poisoned carcasses who could have gone to feeding a hungry village or a city at this rate. It also reminds me of a story back in early European settlement times in Rarauhe, where seals were being processed by settlers and their dead bodies would be thrown out into the harbour, thousands just floating there. And local tangata whenua called upon the rangatira of the time, Hone Heke, who came and dealt to the abusers of Papatūānuku. All I'm saying is, if we're going to use these old stories to justify our actions of today, we need to be aware that things go both ways. This next one touches on that same sentiment. Tame says, perhaps it's the fact that 1080 results in large quantities of dead laying around. Again, this is not something new to our culture. After battles, our tupuna would lay out dead bodies, such as on the large rock Te Aroaro o Te Rangi ka Aotearoa on Mokoia Island in Lake Rotorua, where the dead were splayed out to dry. Tame is going for the hard sell on this one. He's trying to say that 1080 is okay because it's like war. Pretty sure we don't like war. I mean, this has got to be the most ridiculous argument of them all. Does the fact that Māori had battles and war mean that we should be insensitive to death and suffering? Does it justify battles and war? This most of all highlights the problem with Tame's line of reasoning. Actions of the past don't justify actions of the present. These battles were a tragedy, and the death of millions of introduced species from 1080 is also a tragedy. Using an inherently unethical thing to justify 1080 does you no favors. It only highlights how messed up 1080 is. Let's just go around killing lots of people and lots of animals and just leave their bodies laying around. Normal as. Māori used to do it. You know they used to eat people too? Okay, but seriously, what this does is it perpetuates this notion that Māori were a violent, savage race. Normalising warfare and violence, Tame? We're trying to move away from the myth of the warrior gene. Come on, bro. Alright, moving on. What's he got next? So, I end by saying that perhaps the most Māori way I can think of to manage pest animals is to put the needs of the environment above the needs and wants of humans. After all, it was human greed that got us in this mess. Agreed, we should not put humans first, but that's exactly what our national response to introduced species is all about. We center human wants above everything. Protect that trophy species, save that tourism goldmine, establish that conservationist state for rich resort goers, creating the illusion that we're protecting biodiversity. If we actually wanted to put the environment first, we'd stop knowingly polluting her. We'd clean up our waterways, we'd stop destructive industrial farming practices, and take meaningful action on climate change. But no, instead, let's scapegoat our actions with the purest expressions of life from Papatūānuku, her animals. So, what's the take-home message? Well, firstly, Māori had some really cool, non-violent ways of protecting their kai and living with other animals. Secondly, the spin-off seemingly lets you say whatever you want as long as it involves killing introduced species. Thirdly, if one Māori says something, don't think they speak for the rest of us. Just like me, don't think that I speak for anyone but myself. That's all for today. Kia ora tātou, noho rā mai rā. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, share us on Facebook, and chuck us in your Instagram stories. And if you really like this video and you want to make a donation, you can support us on Ko-fi.com. See you in the next video.